In 1919, Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles and accept defeat in World War I. The Allies imposed harsh restrictions to prevent the country from starting another war. The German army was limited to 100,000 men, divided into 7 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions. The use of heavy artillery, tanks, and water-cooled weapons was banned. Soldiers were also required to be volunteers, not compulsory recruits. The import and production of weapons was also banned. With these measures, the powers sought to eliminate Germany's military capability and keep it under control. However, the sanctions and national humiliation generated deep resentment that would shape the country's future. The Treaty of Versailles failed to eliminate the widespread belief in Germany that the defeat in World War I was not the fault of the army, but of internal political and social errors. Despite the imposed restrictions, the small German army maintained its pride and discipline, rigorously training under the leadership of General Hans von Seeckt, a strategist whom the Allies surprisingly allowed to retain in command despite their recognition of his military talent. Von Seeckt reorganized the forces with a selective and highly professional approach. Both officers and men considered themselves guardians of the true German military spirit and the ideal of combat efficiency. His objective was clear: to keep the military tradition alive and prepare the ground for a larger and more powerful future army, which would be reborn when Germany could free itself from the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Since its origin, the Reichsheer, it was conceived as a foundation upon which, when the time came, a much larger army would be built. Although it officially complied with the limitations of the Treaty of Versailles, in practice there were multiple ways to circumvent it. Various civilian organizations kept the German military spirit alive. Shooting clubs trained young men in the use of weapons and fostered camaraderie among soldiers, while veterans associations and social aid groups served as networks capable of mobilizing men if necessary. At the same time, the German High Command discreetly sent officers abroad to study advances in weaponry and combat tactics. These trips, disguised as observation or cooperation missions, allowed military knowledge to be kept up to date despite the restrictions imposed. Among the most significant missions were visits by young officers such as Heinz Guderian, who became deeply interested in mechanized warfare. In collaboration with the Soviet Union, several of them received training at the Kazan Armored Center, where they studied the use and coordination of tanks, knowledge that would later be fundamental to the resurgence of German military power and the development of the future Blitzkrieg. At the beginning of the 1930s, the Reichsheer. He was now ready to expand his ranks and regain his power. Although he had traditionally avoided political involvement, he eventually became active in the rise of the National Socialist Party, in part because there was no viable alternative to Adolf Hitler. Germany's president, the veteran Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, was a highly respected figure within the military, as were the Chancellor and War Minister, Generals Kurt von Schleicher and Werner von Blomberg, respectively. It was Blomberg who was given the secret mission of ensuring that the armed forces would not oppose Hitler's appointment as the new Chancellor after Schleicher's departure. His intervention ensured the support, or at least the neutrality, of the army at a decisive moment for Germany's destiny. Although many officers considered Hitler a mere Austrian corporal with delusions of grandeur, they understood that his rise to power could facilitate the military recovery they so desperately desired. They privately despised him for his humble origins and constant need for recognition, but they accepted his leadership as long as he maintained the army as the sword of the nation. In March 1935, with his power now consolidated and the implicit support of the army, Adolf Hitler officially announced that Germany was abandoning the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. He proclaimed the creation of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, and reinstated conscription with the aim of expanding the army to 36 divisions. This decision took many military commanders by surprise, who had only planned a moderate expansion of up to 21 divisions. Hitler was not prepared to wait. Barely 2 months later, in May 1935, he ordered the army to prepare the Nazi regime's first military action, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a region whose demilitarization had been one of the strictest conditions of the treaty. With this maneuver, the Führer openly challenged the victorious powers of the First World War, convinced that none would intervene to stop him. By then, armored vehicle development projects were already showing promising results. Enthusiastic officers in armored units had tested new tank models, although they were still in the experimental phase. Hitler quickly grasped the potential of these vehicles and saw in them an opportunity to combine German tactical innovation, inspired, interestingly, by British ideas, with the resurgence of domestic industry. From this union, a new concept of warfare would emerge, swift, coordinated, and lethal. With the reorganization of the army and the incorporation of mechanized divisions, Germany began to regain not only its military strength but also its confidence. The country, humiliated by Versailles, was preparing to challenge the world once again. With the political backing of the Nazi Party, the German army founded its first 3 panzer divisions in 1935, a decisive step towards military modernization. To integrate them into the existing structure, it was decided to transform the regiments of cavalry in armored units. At first, these divisions only existed on paper, as real tanks were still under development. But that didn't stop Adolf Hitler, who was determined to advance without delay. In March 1936, the Führer ordered his first major military maneuver, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, a region that had been demilitarized since the end of the First World War. The operation was a direct challenge to the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact, and tested the will of the European powers. At the time, the French army was vastly superior in numbers and equipment, and many historians agree that a firm French military response could have stopped Hitler and halted his rise. However, the German leader correctly calculated the inaction of his rivals. He observed that Italy's recent war against Abyssinia had provoked only verbal condemnation and a weak economic embargo, without military intervention. With that certainty, he took a risk. He ordered his troops to cross the Rhine and occupy the Rhineland, convinced that France and the United Kingdom would not act. Moreover, the maneuver coincided with a time of great political tension in France, which was concerned about its cooperation pact with the Soviet Union. While Paris hesitated and London watched silently, German troops completed the occupation without resistance. It was a political and psychological triumph for Hitler, who understood that the free world was not willing to stop him. At least, not yet. At the end of 1937, a decisive event strengthened Adolf Hitler's absolute control over the German armed forces. At a November meeting of the High Staff, the Führer declared that war was inevitable and that Germany must begin its expansion with the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. The generals present were shocked by the audacity of the plan, and both War Minister Werner von Blomberg and Commander-in-Chief Werner von Fritsch were openly opposed, warning that the army was not yet ready for a campaign of that magnitude. Both officers insisted that a period of consolidation was necessary, as recent expansions and rapid rearmament had created a logistical and structural imbalance. But Hitler was unwilling to tolerate dissent. In response, he unleashed a calculated political maneuver. He falsely accused Blomberg and Fritsch of personal scandals, corruption and homosexuality, respectively, and succeeded in removing them from their posts. Although Fritsch was later acquitted, his reputation was destroyed and he was never reinstated. The Führer took advantage of the moment to completely reorganize the military hierarchy, removing any obstacles to his authority. He proclaimed himself Supreme Commander of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, thus assuming direct control of all branches of the German military. In his new power scheme, he appointed General Wilhelm Keitel as Chief of Staff and later to Alfred Jodl as Chief of Operations. With this restructuring, Hitler achieved what he had always sought, a fully subordinated to his will, with no critical voices to question his decisions, paving the way for the military expansion that would soon shake all of Europe. In the spring of 1938, Hitler saw an opportunity to incorporate Austria into the Reich. The hastily planned operation, complete with some logistical errors, was carried out on March 12th without resistance. German troops crossed the border amid cheers and flags, and Austria was officially annexed to the Greater German Empire. Hitler presented the Union as a glorious and peaceful victory that reinforced his prestige both within and outside of Germany. His next target was Czechoslovakia, a country strategically surrounded by German territory and with a German minority concentrated in the Sudetenland. Hitler demanded the surrender of that region, which would have left the Czechs virtually defenseless. Faced with Prague's refusal and fearing a war in Central Europe, France and the United Kingdom intervened diplomatically. The result was the Munich Agreement, September 1938, by which Germany obtained the Sudetenland in exchange for promising not to claim more territories, a promise that Hitler would soon break. The German military was uneasy about the regime's expansionist course. General Ludwig Beck attempted to organize internal opposition, but failed to gain support and was replaced by the more pragmatic, order-following Franz Halder. In March 1939, Germany completed its occupation of Czechoslovakia, taking advantage of internal tensions to create an independent Slovakia under its control. The annexation expanded the Reich's borders and provided access to important weapons and vehicle factories, as well as enough equipment to form 3 new panzer divisions, consolidating the military machine that would soon spark World War II. Following the annexation of Czechoslovakia, Hitler turned his attention to Poland, which caused great concern among the German army command. Poland maintained defense pacts with France and Great Britain, so an attack on that country could trigger a continental conflict of enormous proportions. Senior officers feared facing a simultaneous war in the east and west, since a Franco-British offensive would penetrate the Siegfried Line, West Wall. A defensive chain still incomplete despite Nazi propaganda that presented it as impenetrable. Hitler ignored warnings about the fragility of these fortifications and refused to publicly acknowledge their true state. Instead, he managed to calm the army's fears with a bold diplomatic move. In August 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that included a secret protocol dividing Poland between the two countries. With this temporary alliance, Berlin neutralized the threat of having to fight on 2 fronts and gained freedom of action in the east. On September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border, beginning World War II. Thanks to their tactical coordination and logistical superiority, the Germans were confident of a quick victory in western Poland, while the Soviet army would occupy the other half of the country weeks later. Despite the risks, the German commanders felt confident. They believed that France and Great Britain would not go beyond diplomatic protests and would soon accept the new fait accompli. Hitler shared this view and was convinced that the Western powers, fearful of another war like that of 1914, would once again opt for inaction. He had no idea that this invasion would change the fate of the world. From a military perspective, by the end of 1939, the German army had an offensive capability superior to that of most European armies. It had 6 panzer divisions, 4 light divisions, soon to be reorganized into new armored units, and 4 motorized divisions. In total, these 14 mobile divisions gave it great tactical and operational agility. However, a large part of the army still relied on the use of horses to transport troops, supplies, and artillery pieces, highlighting a contrast between modernity and traditional methods. Even with these limitations, Germany possessed a decisive strategic advantage. Its ability to rapidly mobilize all the necessary troops to form 53 divisions in total, combined with the support of an elite tactical air force, the Luftwaffe, capable of devastating enemy positions before the ground advance. The German army also applied a revolutionary concept of warfare, Blitzkrieg. This tactic was based on coordinated attacks between air, tank, and motorized units, which penetrated deeply through encircling movements, disorganizing defenses and leaving the enemy unable to respond. Behind the rapid-fire forces advanced the infantry, tasked with occupying the terrain and eliminating pockets of resistance with artillery support. This combination of speed, surprise, and coordination gave the Germans complete confidence that the Polish campaign would be short and successful without jeopardizing the security of the Reich. The events in Poland in September 1939 demonstrated that the German army was capable of achieving swift and decisive victories with minimal human and material losses. Its military machine operated with impressive efficiency. The panzers advanced in the vanguard, followed by infantry and towed artillery, while the Luftwaffe acted as a flying artillery that devastated enemy defenses before the ground attack. This tactical system, the Blitzkrieg, functioned flawlessly for more than 2 years, until the German advance was finally halted at the gates of Moscow in December 1941. During those 27 months, the German army reached its peak. Its success was largely due to the superior organization of its forces and the excellent use of its tanks and artillery. Although some nations possessed superior armored vehicles, they rarely managed to coordinate them into effective units. This lack of cohesion allowed Germany to maintain the momentum of its offensives and dominate much of Europe in record time. However, these victories were accompanied by growing problems. Recovery of damaged vehicles was slow, affecting the continuity of operations. Furthermore, emerged internal conflicts arose between the generals of the armored forces and those of the infantry. The former advocated the use of tanks to carry out large encircling maneuvers that would disorganize the enemy, leaving the final destruction to the infantry. The latter demanded that the panzers provide direct support at the front, even if this limited their penetration capacity. Hitler sided with the armored commanders, consolidating Blitzkrieg as the core of his military strategy. Even under these tensions, German generals demonstrated a remarkable ability to improvise tactics and respond quickly to unforeseen situations. A prominent example was Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group South during the Polish campaign. When Polish forces attempted to break out westward from the Bzura pocket, Rundstedt maneuvered with precision and succeeded in completely encircling them, confirming German tactical superiority in the early years of the war. Operation Barbarossa, initially planned for the spring, was ultimately delayed until June 21, 1941. Despite the delay, the invasion of the Soviet Union began with apparent success. Germany had a powerful, disciplined army, perfectly trained in Blitzkrieg tactics, which had already proven effective in Poland, France, and the Balkans. The 4th Panzer Group, commanded by General Erich Hoepner, spearheaded the advance of Army Group North, led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, with 3 panzer and 3 infantry divisions advancing towards Leningrad. In the south, the 1st Panzergruppe, under Marshal Ewald von Kleist, with 5 armored and 3 infantry divisions, led the advance of Army Group South of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, towards Ukraine. The main effort, however, fell on Army Group Center, led by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, whose objective was Moscow. This offensive used a double pincer tactic with 2 powerful armored groups, the 3rd Panzer Group, under General Hermann Hoth, with 4 panzer and 3 infantry divisions, advancing from the north, and the 2nd Panzer Group, led by General Heinz Guderian, with 5 panzer and 4 infantry divisions attacking from the south. In total, the Wehrmacht deployed 17 panzer divisions and 103 infantry divisions, supported by 14 Romanian and 2 Hungarian divisions on the southern sector, plus 15 Finnish divisions backed by 5 German ones in the far north. Facing them, the Soviet army fielded 28 armored divisions, but their apparent numerical superiority did not translate into a real advantage. The Soviet Union lacked the experience and tactical coordination of the Germans. Its armored units were scattered, assigned to different armies without a common structure like that of the Panzergruppen. Furthermore, the Soviets continued to employ combined tank and infantry tactics that were already obsolete compared to the speed and precision of the Blitzkrieg. Consequently, despite having more tanks, the Soviet forces were at a distinct disadvantage against the German formations, which were much better organized, trained, and had infinitely more effective tactical command. The German army's tactical and organizational superiority resulted in a series of dizzying advances in the first months of the campaign. Wehrmacht forces managed to enclose millions of Soviet soldiers, capturing huge quantities of weapons, vehicles, and supplies. The offensive seemed unstoppable, and German columns pushed deeper and deeper into the heart of Western Russia, convinced that final victory was within reach. However, the territory they had to cover was vast, and the distances between the battle lines and supply bases grew every day. Roads were scarce, paths dusty or muddy, and transportation insufficient. Logistics began to become a serious problem. Both soldiers and horses were exhausted after weeks of uninterrupted marching and constant fighting. Adding to this situation was the scorched earth strategy applied by the Soviets. During their retreat, they destroyed everything that could be useful to the enemy: crops, bridges, warehouses, railroads, and factories. As a result, the Germans found themselves with a devastated territory, without local resources to exploit, and with increasing difficulty resupplying their motorized units with fuel and ammunition. With the arrival of autumn, the German advance became almost impossible. The rains turned the roads and fields into thick mud, paralyzing vehicles and slowing troop movement. Soon after, the Russian winter fell with extreme harshness. The mud froze and temperatures dropped to unbearable levels. The German forces, without adequate clothing or equipment for the cold, were virtually immobilized next to their damaged or frozen vehicles. Army Group Center managed to reach the outskirts of Moscow but was eventually halted. At that moment, the arrival of Siberian troops, trained for winter combat and equipped to withstand the low temperatures, turned the tide of the battle. With their intervention, the Soviets halted the German advance and eliminated any possibility of a quick victory over the Soviet Union. Many German generals later maintained that the defeat was due solely to the weather and Hitler's constant intervention in military decisions, stating that without these circumstances they would have won in 1941. However, this interpretation ignores the resilience of the Soviet army and people who continued to fight resolutely. The Soviets had evacuated and destroyed vital resources before the Germans arrived and managed to move entire factories east of the Urals, reinstall them in record time and resume war production, thus ensuring their ability to continue fighting despite initial losses. One of the most serious mistakes of Operation Barbarossa was the lack of foresight regarding the enormous expanse of Soviet territory. The German commanders failed to understand that Blitzkrieg tactics, effective in short, concentrated campaigns, lost their meaning in such a vast space. The Luftwaffe could not cover or control such a deep rear area, making it impossible to prevent the movement of enemy troops and supplies. In addition, the immense distances exhausted both soldiers and horses, and the mechanical wear and tear on the vehicles, aggravated by dust and poor ground conditions, far exceeded what German planners had anticipated. Russian infrastructure also represented a decisive obstacle. Except for the Minsk-Moscow highway, there were almost no passable roads. The paths became veritable quagmires during the autumn rains, trapping tanks and trucks in the mud. Added to this was the difference in the gauge of the railways between Germany and the USSR. As the Soviets retreated, they destroyed locomotives, wagons, and rolling stock, forcing the Germans to realign the tracks before they could be used, further slowing down supplies. These factors caused a constant strain on the invading forces, which weakened as they advanced eastward. Motorized columns and armored divisions lost effectiveness, while logistical lines stretched to the point of becoming unsustainable. Added to this was an even greater strategic problem. The German front stretched from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, with 3 army groups advancing in different directions: northeast toward Leningrad, east toward Moscow, and southeast toward Kiev. The deeper they penetrated Russia, the more separated they became, making mutual support difficult. This dispersion allowed the Red Army to concentrate superior forces in specific sectors, exploit the gaps between German formations, and begin to halt the offensive, which until then had seemed invincible. In addition to operating in a vast and desolate territory, the German forces did so without a clear strategic direction. The High Command lacked a defined plan beyond the general goal of annihilating the Soviet Union and destroying its political system. There was no concrete military objective or precise territorial goal to guide the campaign. The only reference point mentioned was a theoretical line stretching from Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea to Arkhangelsk on the White Sea. Although this border seemed ambitious on the map, it actually had no strategic value. It lacked natural defense elements such as mountains or rivers that would have allowed for establishing firm positions or a sustainable front. As a result, the German army advanced without a tangible goal, dispersing its forces in all directions and exhausting itself in an undefined space. This lack of concrete objectives turned the operation into a directionless campaign where each tactical victory lacked real strategic significance. The situation worsened with the growing impotence of Field Marshal von Brauchitsch and General Franz Halder, the 2 officers in charge of the OKH. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, both knew that their role would not be to control the course of the campaign, but to serve Hitler's brilliant strategic intuition. The best example is the loss of around 2.5 weeks in deciding whether Ukraine or Moscow should be the first objective of the campaign. The army believed that Moscow should be the primary objective, so Halder and Bock, who did not dare to do it personally, entrusted Guderian with the task of convincing Hitler of this during a high command meeting in Lützen on the 23rd of August. Von Brauchitsch took careful note of this, and he forbade Guderian to even mention Moscow. But Guderian decided it was necessary and suggested that the Soviet capital was more important than Ukraine. At that time, No general supported Guderian. On the contrary, all his colleagues agreed with Hitler's idea that Ukraine should be attacked first, since it was of greater economic importance to Germany. This deliberation cost them 2.5 weeks, precious time, as the German forces were still in the vicinity of Moscow when winter and Siberian reinforcements arrived. Germany's great opportunity, if there ever was one, was lost due to Hitler's flawed strategic vision and the servility of most of the generals. As if the German forces were already suffering enough in the field, winter caught them completely devoid of any warm clothing, which, due to the tremendous inefficiency of the quartermaster's department, was quietly waiting for the soldiers in Warsaw. Hitler's reaction to the December 1941 failure at Moscow was to indiscriminately dismiss most of the commanders and, worse still, personally assume the duties of Commander-in-Chief of the army as Brauchitz's successor. The Army High Command, having seen how its professional advice could do nothing against Hitler's intuitions, had to watch its functions usurped by a man whose concept of strategy was increasingly confused with the idea of standing firm at any price. This policy, which was frequently ignored by the commanders at the front, with the risk that this entailed when the fact reached Hitler's ears, extraordinarily diminished the army's capabilities on the Eastern Front. The armies were forced to create defenses where they should not have been, and this, in addition to causing enormous amounts of irreplaceable human and material losses, gave great strategic opportunities to the Soviet High General Staff, which was proving increasingly competent. Operation Barbarossa began to unravel due to two fundamental flaws. The first was the vastness of Soviet territory, which completely overwhelmed the Blitzkrieg model. German forces were unable to maintain the momentum of such a vast offensive, and the Luftwaffe it was unable to destroy or weaken the Soviet armies further east, especially those in Siberia, which would later enter the fray. The vast distances exhausted the troops and forced them to send hundreds of panzer tanks repaired, even if they had not been hit in battle, only due to the wear and tear of the terrain. Outside the main Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow highway, paved roads were almost non-existent. Paths turned into quagmires in the rain, and Russian railways, with a different gauge from the German one, had to be modified one by one to transport supplies. These factors made the loss of momentum in the offensive inevitable. The further the Germans advanced eastward, the more dispersed their forces became and the less ability they had to regroup in an emergency. In contrast, the Red Army could quickly concentrate fresh troops to launch local counterattacks that wore down the offensive. And worse, there was no clear point of arrival. The so-called AA line, Archangel Astrakhan, drawn by Hitler as a goal, was completely devoid of strategic sense. It was a border without natural defenses, impossible to hold against a determined enemy with seemingly inexhaustible resources. Along the long front stretching from Leningrad to the Black Sea, there were no natural points of defense or clearly defined objectives. The offensive had to be carried out on an immense front which created serious coordination problems between the different army groups. It was impossible to assign fixed objectives to each commander, since no one could predict precisely where the enemy's main force would be concentrated once the front penetrated deep into Russian territory. In theory, if the situation required Army Group Center to support Army Group North, a superior order and immediate cooperation between commanders would suffice. In practice, this never happened. Personal rivalries, poor communication, and the pride of the High Command undermined the unity of the German army. 5 generals stood out for their indiscipline or disagreement with the Central Command. Von Bock, at the head of Army Group Center, dreamed of going down in history as the conqueror of Moscow and the great destroyer of Bolshevism. However, he was under pressure from several officers on his general staff who were part of the anti-Hitler resistance, urging him to lead a coup against the regime. Under his command were 2 opposing figures. Kluge, always complaining that Guderian's panzers they would advance without infantry support, and Guderian impetuous and hostile to any attempt to limit his tactical freedom. Above them was the ineffective duo of Halder and Brauchitsch, heads of the OKH, whose power was now purely formal. From the very beginning of the invasion, in June 1941, it was clear that real control lay with Hitler, whose unpredictable strategic intuition prevailed over all military planning. All the generals knew, the final word would never be the army's, but the Führer's. For years it has been repeated that the blame for Germany's failure before Moscow lay entirely with Hitler for diverting forces to cleanse Ukraine before the final attack. However, a significant part of the responsibility also falls on his generals, who wasted more than 2 decisive weeks in internal disputes and strategic vacillations. The conferences held in Novi Borisov, July 27th, and Lutzen, August 23rd, reflected this indecision. The latter presented the central dilemma: should we advance on Moscow or Ukraine? Halder and von Bock, unable to confront Hitler directly, delegated the task to Guderian, hoping to convince him to attack Moscow without delay. But Brauchitsch, already overcome with fear, went so far as to forbid him from mentioning the name of the Soviet capital. Guderian disobeyed, but was silenced by the collective submission of the rest of the commanders, who nodded while Hitler irritably insisted that his generals were unaware of the economic dimension of the war and that Ukraine must be the first objective. That decision proved disastrous. By the time the German army resumed its offensive toward Moscow, the first frosts of winter had already arrived. Although on paper the German army had managed to destroy a large portion of the Red Army's estimated strength, new Soviet divisions emerged one after another. Furthermore, the appearance of the T-34, a Soviet tank superior in power, armor, and mobility, completely surprised the German crews and neutralized part of their tactical advantage. The final defeat was aggravated by the negligence of the High Command, which, confident of a quick victory, had failed to anticipate the severity of the Russian winter. As temperatures plummeted, the German army's winter equipment was still held at the Warsaw Station, while thousands of soldiers on the Eastern Front faced the extreme cold without shelter, without fuel, and with their machinery frozen. During the Battle of Moscow, the German army's most implacable enemy was not the Red Army, but the extreme cold. However, the order to resist to the end came directly from Hitler, who rejected any proposal for a strategic retreat and dismissed all the generals who dared to suggest it. He took absolute command of the army from von Brauchitsch, and issued an inflexible instruction: defend every inch of ground and die where you were. Sub-zero temperatures froze the ground, making it impossible to dig trenches, and thousands of soldiers froze to death. Even so, the German front remained standing until March 1942, when Stalin launched a poorly coordinated offensive. Since September 1939, the Wehrmacht had racked up the greatest victories in its history, but none had achieved the main objective: ending the war. Now Britain had an ally that Germany could never completely defeat: the Soviet Union. 2/3 of German forces were trapped in vast Russian territory. They had partially conquered it, but beyond Moscow, they could neither advance nor retreat without risking collapse. The German offensive of the summer of 1942 was an example of this. Hitler wanted both Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and that meant that the 4th Panzer Army had to first support the Caucasus campaign when it crossed the Don, and then fall back on Stalingrad. The result of the operation was disastrous, because the Germans missed the opportunity to occupy Stalingrad when it was offering little resistance in August. So Paulus decided, being the first time he commanded a force, to attack the strong Soviet defenses frontally, which was quite absurd from a tactical point of view. The third reason was that Hitler insisted that the territory that had been won with German blood could not be lost. When Stalingrad was surrounded, the 6th Army could have been saved without too much difficulty. But Paulus stood his ground in accordance with Hitler's orders. It is also true that they were not the only ones who believed they could hold the city and resist Soviet attacks, because at the beginning of the war, the German troops that had remained in the large pockets of Demyansk and Kolm had managed to do so thanks to the transport possibilities offered by the Luftwaffe. Now everything was set to end in one of the most disastrous episodes in German military history. The Soviets hurled themselves at the isolated Germans in Stalingrad, and in November 1942 launched a massive pincer movement that swept through the flanking defenses of the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies in 4 days to block the German 6th Army and part of the 4th Panzer Army at Stalingrad. The remainder of the 4th Panzer Army launched a powerful offensive to free the forces trapped in Stalingrad in December, but were repulsed when they were very close to the city, whose garrison, Hitler had been assured by the Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, was taking no risks because his Luftwaffe was able to provide all the necessary food, ammunition, fuel, and other equipment. The fact is that the Luftwaffe was never able to deliver their daily supplies, and since the Soviets had tightened the noose around the garrison and it lacked an airfield, the 200,000 men who remained after 100,000 had been killed in combat, and only 34,000 could be evacuated by plane had to surrender from starvation in February 1943. Stalingrad might have fallen in September to a series of complicated concentric attacks, but the sledgehammer thrusts by German Commander von Paulus in his first independent command were enormously costly and resulted in a crushing battle of attrition in which the Russians had the upper hand. Meanwhile, the depleted Italian and Romanian divisions flanking the Sixth Army were targeted by Zhukov for a counter-offensive. Hitler's obsession with the Kuban and Caucasus oil fields had also failed to materialize. Kleist's First Panzer Army found that the further it went, the harder the fighting became. Things were only getting worse. By the end of October, the Germans were held up in the Upper Caucasus and along the Terek River. By 1943, most German officers understood that the war was lost. The Western Allies had landed in North Africa in late 1942, and after an initial stumble by the US Army at the Kasserine Pass, the British and American armies succeeded in driving the Axis forces from their beachhead in Tunisia. Axis clumsiness in the delicate coordination of coastal operations delayed evacuation until it was no longer possible, and the Axis collapsed as a result. In Tunisia in May 1943, the entire German contingent was lost, a shocking sacrifice for a front that had no decisive value. The Allies took advantage of the victory in Tunisia to invade Sicily in July and then land on the Italian mainland in September. The first offensive took Sicily and overthrew Mussolini. The second took Italy away from the Axis, a devastating blow to the German strategic position. Italy, a weak power without a strong military tradition, natural resources, or a significant industrial base, remained Germany's main ally in Europe and the only one that could be considered, albeit in a limited way, a great power. Faced with the collapse of Italy, the Germans launched Operation Axis, which consisted of occupying Italy, disarming its army and sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers Italians to labor camps in the Reich. Although often praised for its speed and effectiveness, Operation Axis was in fact a brutal act of aggression, the main result of which was to force Germany to deploy an entire field army, and later an army group, to defend the Italian peninsula, perhaps the last thing the Wehrmacht needed in 1943. Events in the east further aggravated these disasters. The last major German offensive in the Soviet Union, Operation Citadel, took place in July 1943. It was a typically German operation: meticulous preparation, huge tank concentrations, and a concentric maneuver plan directed against the city of Kursk. Unfortunately, it was also an utter failure. The offensive ran headlong into a wall of Soviet defenses in depth, grinding to a halt within days. The Soviets resisted with cold blood and then counterattacked strongly, both northwards towards Orel and southwards towards Belgorod, inflicting massive losses on the German forces. The casualties were enormous, and the Germans were pushed back into retreat, which did not stop until they reached the Dnieper River. At that point, the Soviet pursuit was so close, literally on the heels of the retreating Wehrmacht, with columns intermingled and operational confusion beyond words, that the Germans were unable even to hold the line of the Great River. By the end of September, the Soviets had crossed the Dnieper at several points, eventually linking their positions to form a massive bridgehead on the west bank. In November, Soviet troops battled into Kiev, liberating the mother of Russian cities. However, their attempt to advance westward from the Kiev salient failed in the face of a spirited and masterfully conducted defense by the German 48th Panzer Corps under General Hermann Black. Considered one of the Wehrmacht's most capable tank commanders, Balck inflicted a severe blow on the Soviets between Zhytomyr and Brusilov, managing to encircle and destroy the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps and the Soviet 5th and 8th Tank Corps. The closure of the Zhytomyr pocket put an end to the operational sequence initiated in Kursk. The Army Group commander, Field Marshal Georg von Küchler, repeatedly attempted to withdraw divisions from the front to form a reserve, but the usual result was an order from Hitler or the General Staff. That completely removed his authority over these divisions. 1943, a rational analysis indicated to the High Command of the Wehrmacht that the war was lost, and they themselves acknowledged this on numerous occasions, both in their records of the time and in their later memoirs. However, military tradition, reinforced in 1,000 different ways, pushed them to keep faith and keep fighting. In this context, another old Prussian custom played a decisive role in crystallizing their mentality: the Totenritt, or ride to death. Historians often accuse Hitler of unprofessional and faulty decision-making for his insistence on holding every position to the last man and gun, declaring every town a fortress, Festung, every village a fortified point, Feste, Platz, and ordering to fight for every inch of land. Yes, such a speech was irrational, but the Führer's defiant attitude, standing up to the whole world, raising his fist against fate and refusing to surrender, was perfectly in the tradition of Frederick the Great. The Nazi regime had devoted years of propaganda to presenting itself as the legitimate heir of old Prussia, something symbolized by the 1933 Potsdam Day and now reflected in its slogan to resist at all costs, halten, jeden Preis. Thus, like the old Prussian leaders, the Third Reich called on its officers to win or die, a message that struck a chord with many of them, especially those at the front. In fact, his response was not always fully conscious, and when the news of Roosevelt's death reached the bunker in April 1945, it seemed to more than one person like a new miracle of the House of Brandenburg, one more illusion in the midst of the final collapse. Wehrmacht, the last flame of the German Empire. His strategic situation in January 1945 was completely desperate. In the west, the Allies were advancing towards the Rhine. In the east, the Red Army was assembling over 400 divisions ready to march on. Berlin, and in the south, Soviet forces were besieging the Hungarian capital, Budapest. Only in Italy did the front remain relatively stable. The once proud Wehrmacht had become a shadow of its former power. Although around 7 million Germans remained under arms, they suffered extreme shortages of ammunition, supplies and equipment while morale crumbled. Only on the Eastern Front did the army maintain any fighting spirit, and even then it did so with only one purpose: to hold out long enough to be able to flee westward and surrender to the Western Allies rather than fall into Soviet hands. In his bunker in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, buried deep underground, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He still believed that as long as their armies continued to fight, there was a chance that the Western Allies and the Soviets would break their alliance and turn on each other. It was a completely irrational idea, but the Führer was already on the verge of physical and mental collapse. He ignored intelligence reports warning of overwhelming Soviet superiority on the Eastern Front, calling them absurd, and even went so far as to suggest that the German Army intelligence chief, General Reinhard Gehlen, was to be admitted to a mental hospital. Gehlen's Foreign Armies of the East organization were the most accurate produced in the entire war, but Hitler could no longer grasp the reality. The German army's divisions were so weakened that many barely reached regimental strength, and the collapse of the Reich was only a matter of time. Will to continue the war remained unshaken. He ordered the arrest of dozens of high-ranking officers who disobeyed his orders, while others were demoted and sent to the front as mere lieutenants or privates. The Gauleiter, regional leaders of the Nazi Party, were given absolute authority over the defense of their zones, with permission to dismiss any officer who showed signs of disloyalty. These officials answered directly to Martin Bormann, the Führer's most trusted confidant, and constantly intervened in military affairs, often simply to demonstrate their power. Despite the chaos and repression, the German army continued to fight, driven by the personal oath of loyalty to Hitler that both officers and soldiers swore, had rendered. As professional soldiers, they could not conceive of the dishonor of abandoning their country at the moment of greatest danger. Erwin Rommel himself, a symbol of German military honor, summed up that sentiment in October 1944, as he awaited his fate after being accused of participating in the July 20th plot against Hitler. He told his son, "Our enemy to the east is so terrible that every other consideration must yield to him. If he succeeds in seizing Europe, even for a time, it will be the end of everything that makes life worth living." Of course I would go. His words reflected the moral tragedy of the German officer corps, caught between military duty, personal loyalty, and the awareness of inevitable disaster. In January 1945, a final attempt was made to rebuild the Wehrmacht to defend the homeland. Countless orders were issued demanding the creation of new panzer divisions, infantry divisions, artillery units, and anti-tank brigades. However, most of these formations existed only on paper or were made up of incomplete and poorly trained battalions. A clear example was the Panzer Division Clausewitz, the last to be formed, which had only 39 tanks and a few thousand men. Hitler hoped that by giving them names inspired by Germany's glorious military past, the troops would be motivated to fight to the bitter end. But the reality was bleak. Finding experienced officers and skilled soldiers was nearly impossible. The German army's training system had completely collapsed. There were no instructors left, no operational training centers. Each division was forced to recruit old men and teenagers from the Volkssturm, the National Guard, who, although they showed a willingness to fight, lacked training, rifles, and ammunition. Meanwhile, German war production was grinding to a halt under relentless Allied bombing and raw material shortages. Tank and aircraft production halted in February 1945, and synthetic fuel production was reduced to a fraction as Soviet troops cut off access to the oil fields of Romania and Hungary. The railway system, vital for military transport, was also on the verge of collapse. Allied bombers destroyed strategic bridges and marshalling yards, leaving Germany isolated and its war machine irrevocably crumbling from within. Last major armoured reserve consisted of the 5 Waffen-SS Panzer divisions grouped into the 6th SS Panzer Army. By mid-January 1945, these units were withdrawn from the Western Front. They had suffered heavy losses during the Ardennes offensive and so received the few new tanks still rolling out of the factories. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the Army General Staff, insisted that these divisions should be used to defend Berlin, since the 12 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, the remaining units on the Eastern Front, had, on average, fewer than 40 operational tanks each. With such weakness, it was impossible to stop the 6,000 Soviet tanks preparing to break into Poland. But Hitler had other plans. He decided to send this elite force with 400 tanks toward Hungary, with the goal of breaking the siege of Budapest and securing the country's oil fields. Guderian protested vehemently, warning that Hungary was a secondary front, but his words were ignored. The result was disastrous. Only one Waffen-SS division was assigned to reinforce the front in Poland, while the others marched south. Thus, by the time the final Soviet offensive toward Berlin began, Germany had lost its last armoured reserve in a maneuver as desperate as it was futile. Allied troops on the Western Front waited until the 8th of February 1945 to begin their advance to the Rhine. 6 armies attacked simultaneously along the entire line from the Netherlands to Switzerland. German forces offered localized resistance, but coordination was already impossible for the exhausted and disorganized armies. In less than a month, the Allies reached the Rhine and were preparing to penetrate the heart of the Reich. On the northern sector, 52,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. On March 7th, the Allies established their first bridge over the Rhine, and on the 22nd of the same month, they began extensive amphibious operations to completely cross the river. On April 1st, Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket. Just over 2 weeks later, some 370,000 German soldiers surrendered amidst the ruins of the Reich's industrial heartland. Model, aware of the total collapse of his forces, refused to surrender and disappeared from the military scene shortly before the capitulation. After the fall of Hitler and the end of the Third Reich, the fate of the Wehrmacht, it was sealed. The once invincible German army crumbled along with the empire it swore to defend. In the last 6 months of the war, the Wehrmacht suffered an estimated 2 million casualties between killed, wounded, and prisoners. In Berlin alone, on May 2nd, the Soviets captured 134,000 German soldiers and a total of 480,000 since the start of their final offensive toward the capital on April 16th. Hitler's death released the German army from its personal oath of loyalty, and across Europe, commanders began negotiating surrenders with the Allied forces. After 6 days of confusing talks, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of Germany and all its armed forces at Reims, France, on May 7, 1945. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht began its disarmament. Some 6 million German soldiers surrendered, most of them to the Western Allies in Germany, Italy, Austria, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. However, thousands of troops in Berlin, Courland, East Prussia, and Czechoslovakia fell prisoner to the Red Army, definitively ending the military power of the Third Reich. Most of these men were concentrated in large improvised prison camps while the Allies decided what to do with them. On the Western Front, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were simply released with orders to take off their uniforms and return home to contribute to the reconstruction of the devastated country. For those who remained in captivity, life was hard and precarious. Between 1945 and 1946, Europe was suffering from severe food shortages, and German prisoners were not exactly a priority. It took many years to return to Germany, as hundreds of thousands were used as forced labor in Britain, France, and other Western European countries. It wasn't until 1948 that most were able to return home. Senior officers, on the other hand, were held longer, awaiting investigations into war crimes. Some took advantage of their captivity to write their memoirs, while others collaborated on Allied analytical studies on the Wehrmacht's performance and military structure. During the war, the 2.38 million German soldiers and 600,000 Axis fighters who fell prisoner to the Red Army suffered a much harsher fate. Most were sent as forced laborers to the Siberian gulags under Stalin's regime. More than 1 million of them, including at least 430,000 Germans, died in captivity before the survivors were released in 1955. Thousands of Waffen-SS officers and Nazi party members were summarily executed, as were tens of thousands of Russians who had served in Hitler's armies. At the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW, and General Alfred Jodl, responsible for operations, were sentenced to death for their part in planning, transmitting, and executing Hitler's illegal orders, which resulted in the murder of 3 million Soviet prisoners as well as scores of Britons and the devastation of much of Europe. Other high-ranking officers were also prosecuted, including Rundstedt, Brauchitsch, Strauss, Kesselring, Manstein, and Hoth. Kesselring. He was sentenced to death for ordering the execution of Italian partisans, while the others received long prison sentences for war crimes. Most were eventually released, especially as the onset of the Cold War made it politically inconvenient to keep generals who had fought against the Soviet Union imprisoned. The legacy of the Wehrmacht, military honor. From the shores of North Africa to the ruins of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich, the Wehrmacht left behind a mark as imposing as it was tragic. Between September 1939 and November 1941, the Polish, Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, French, British, and Soviet armies were defeated one after another in a series of crushing military campaigns. In a matter of months, the German army achieved what had proved impossible during 4 years of bloody warfare in the First World War. General Heinz Guderian once boasted, "Twice after the loss of a world war, the general staff was dissolved by order of the victors. Both actions demonstrate the involuntary respect our enemies feel for this excellent organization." For Hitler's generals, this was the pinnacle of their careers. They had supported his rise to power because he had promised to restore Germany to greatness. And in return, they helped forge one of the most effective war machines in military history. When victory seemed assured, the German soldiers were praised by a grateful nation, and the Führer rewarded them generously, convinced that his army was invincible. The German officer corps was one of the most professional and disciplined in the world, and its military perfectionism bordered on the implacable. Its logical and tactical ability far surpassed that of its adversaries, who were rarely psychologically or physically prepared to face the Wehrmacht on the battlefield. However, the lightning victories intoxicated both Hitler and his army. They hadn't anticipated their enemies would collapse so easily, and the rapidity of their victories made them overconfident, almost drunk with power. Operation Barbarossa proved to be a monumental folly, an unprecedented strategic and moral error. Once the regime began the systematic extermination of Jews and Soviets, there was no turning back. The war had become a conflict of total annihilation, and despite all its organization, Germany was never able to match the industrial and human resources of its enemies. The tactical perfection of the Wehrmacht was useless against the overwhelming Allied war machine, which would eventually bury the Reich under its own excessive ambition. When Hitler proclaimed total war in January 1943, the Wehrmacht took on the new phase of the conflict with renewed determination, ready to resist the Soviets and the Allies in the hope of forcing a draw. Thanks to the enormous reconstruction efforts undertaken during 1943 to prepare for Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive, And again, to counter the Allied invasion of France in 1944, the German army managed to maintain a surprisingly high combat capability, even in the face of numerically and materially superior enemies. The German generals and soldiers fought with total dedication for their Führer and for their homeland, but their sacrifices proved insufficient. In the summer of 1944, between June and July, the Wehrmacht was torn apart by a string of colossal defeats on both the eastern and western fronts, from which it would never recover. From then on, the German army no longer fought to win, but to delay the inevitable while the Reich crumbled under the weight of its own total war. Some of Hitler's former generals claimed after the war that Germany's defeat was not his fault, implying that if the Führer had their professional advice been followed, the disaster could have been avoided. Others pointed to their participation in the July 1944 plot as evidence that they were acting in the best interests of the country. But these excuses were merely classic symptoms of men trying to shift their responsibility onto an already dead Hitler. During the years of victory, the generals sold their souls to the dictator, and when everything fell apart, they blamed everyone but themselves. Those who tried to undo the damage did so too late to turn the tide of the war. They had sworn to give their lives for their Führer, and in the years of defeat, Hitler forced them to keep that oath. Some continued to serve him in the hope of limiting the damage from his increasingly irrational orders, but this became impossible as the dictator assumed absolute control over his military machine. A small group of officers decided to physically eliminate him, but the assassination attempt failed miserably, and most of the plotters were executed by their own comrades. In the end, Hitler manipulated his generals at will, and those men who believed themselves to be formidable strategists revealed themselves to be political dwarfs in the eyes of their master. Judge Geoffrey Lawrence, one of the judges who presided over the Nuremberg trials after the war, was scathing in his condemnation of the German generals. He said, "They have been largely responsible for the misery and suffering that befell millions of men, women, and children. They have dishonored the military profession. Without their strategic guidance, the aggressive ambitions of Hitler and his Nazi accomplices would have been merely theoretical and harmless. Many of these men have made a mockery of the soldier's oath. When it suits them, they claim they were only obeying orders. But when confronted with Hitler's crimes, of which they had knowledge, they say they disobeyed. The truth is they actively participated in those crimes, or they kept silent and acquiesced." Lawrence's words summed up an uncomfortable reality. German generals and soldiers were not merely victims of the regime, but active accomplices in its machinery of destruction. And they weren't alone under Hitler's spell. An entire nation followed him in his vision of a grand destiny, an obsession that ultimately plunged Europe into ruin and, between 1939 and 1945, left behind one of the darkest periods in human history.